This program is sponsored in part by the National Catholic Society of Foresters. Hello again, and welcome to Looking at Social Justice. I'm Jim Grant, and I have the privilege of directing social justice ministry here in the Diocese of Fresno. What we have today is a very unique guest. Over the many years at KNXT, we have interviewed programs of peacemakers. We even had a recent podcast on Quakerism in the Central Valley. We've talked about peace and justice, you might say, all the time. But we've never had someone who is a veteran of foreign wars, who is now a veteran for peace. Joshua Shurley is not only one of those veterans, but he is the president of the local chapter of Veterans for Peace here in Fresno. Joshua comes to us from Fresno, but then did his doctoral studies, believe it or not, in Manchester in the UK, with a doctorate in international relations from the University of Manchester. Comes back and is now teaching the lucky students that they are at Clovis Community in political science. But we're here today not to talk about that great school. We want to talk about you, Josh. So introduce us a little bit about Fresno raised, but then you went to war, come back, do your work at school, go to England, and then come back. Tell us where Veterans for Peace fits into this scenario.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on today, Jim. It's a real honor to be here. So I'm from here, raised here in the Central Valley. Went to high school locally. Like a lot of young people, you know, I was, raised in this sort of culture. Cold War, good guys versus bad guys, war movies, go get 'em, all that good stuff. So I was 17 years old, really excited about the prospects. I was an eager enlistee. I didn't need to be talked into it. You know, I was not I didn't have to be recruited as such. I really made their job easy for them, in a sense.
When was that? When did you
1993.
enlist? 93. Wow.
Yeah. Summer of 1993, just finishing up with high school. So I joined the Army, joined the infantry. I should mention this was not during wartime, this was during the 90s. So there were some things going on. The Gulf War had just wound down. There were some peacekeeping missions in the Balkans and things like that that the Army was doing at the time. Took part in some things like training up foreign militaries, what we call capacity building, these kinds of things. And I re-enlisted. A few times, stayed in the Army. Unlike a lot of Veterans for Peace is a pretty diverse organization. A lot of folks right away realize they're not into the military, they're not cut out for this, and they see the problems with it. I have to admit I was not one of those. I sort of bought into it wholesale. And it really, for me, wasn't until I left the military 8 years later and decided to go back and get an education. My idea was to go back and pursue a college degree and maybe go back to work for the government in some way, shape, or form. And so for me, it was actually not experiences in the military as much as getting out and proceeding with my studies, especially studying abroad. I always sort of had misgivings and some feelings that some of these things weren't right, learning about history and learning about what we were doing. And I wanted to pursue an education so that I could, really my idea was to defend what we do, the important work of the U.S. military in preserving freedom around the world.
Even when you went off to graduate studies?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of had this naive idea that, I'm gonna figure out how to articulate these things so that we don't get a kind of a bad rap. And my doctoral dissertation looked at, I don't know if you remember the Joseph Kony, the Kony 2012. It was a warlord in Central Africa.
Oh, yes.
Back around 2011 or so, and that was right when my PhD kicked off. So that was the subject, looking at that military deployment and how do the civilians perceive it. And anyway, coming out of that, I followed around the American Special Forces and the Ugandan military while they were doing various things and interviewing people all around the region. That's where I really kind of started to take in a very critical look at how this stuff looks from the outside, how it looks to outsiders. And it all just sort of snowballed from there.
So when did you join Veterans for Peace? And tell us who Veterans for Peace might be, because I looked it up. It's a phenomenal website, which is www.veteransforpeace.org, easy to find, filled with great stuff. But how did you gravitate from this awareness of a new reality to suddenly decide, oh, I have my mission now, I'm going to join? How did you learn of Veterans for Peace? What led you to Veterans for Peace? Who are Veterans for Peace?
Right, well, so as I mentioned, left the military, went back, home, went to Fresno State, went abroad to study more. I think like a lot of veterans, we get very lulled into that sense of camaraderie, family, the bonding, and getting away from that is difficult. It's a difficult transition. Friendships don't seem as deep. Connections don't seem as real, so it was a bit of a struggle. Going abroad was an interesting experience. I was attending, like a lot of students would, various talks. Manchester's a very progressive city and very vibrant university campus. Attending talks, and there was a group of people, there were some folks from the former IDF soldiers from the Israeli military who were giving a talk about their experiences.
Oh, former IDF.
Right.
Wow.
But there's a group called Breaking the Silence in Israel that is sort of equivalent to Veterans for Peace.
Wow.
In a sense.
Wow.
And at some point, a local guy was talking about Veterans for Peace, this organization of former British soldiers, and what they were doing. And I went up afterwards and sort of said, well, what a neat idea. I wish we had something like that in the United States. And he said, well, actually, it's from the United States. You should look into it. And so I did exactly that. And just like you, I looked at the website. I thought, well, this is great. And I sort of filed it away, something I'm going to look into later. A couple of years went by. I finished up my studies and field work, and I was pretty busy at the time. Came back here to Fresno, when my two small children were being born, so came back home and getting kind of engaged with the community. I contacted Veterans for Peace and said, hey, where do I find my local chapter? I'd like to link up with these guys. And they said, well, we don't have one in Fresno. Why don't you start one? So I started that process.
Wow.
And had a little bit of help from some local folks. Hollis Higgins was a former Fresno resident who is a member of Veterans for Peace up in Spokane, Washington.
Oh, my.
I don't know if you know Hollis.
Not well, no. But heard of.
And you might know Richard Stone, who just passed.
Who just passed.
Right. He is someone I consider a very real dear friend. I've only knew him about a year and a half before he passed, but he was also real integral. I actually had interviewed him for a research project, and he's the one who sort of encouraged me to say, you should really get involved with this activist community, and there's really a place for you. And he really sort of helped me take those first steps
nice.
to starting the chapter. And I've fell in love ever since. Veterans for Peace is a great organization. It's a worldwide global organization. It's 501c3, nonprofit, based in St. Louis. But it's organized in over 120 autonomous chapters worldwide, mostly in the United States, but we've got a presence in Europe, Mexico, a few other places around the world, Okinawa, Japan, Korea, and some other places. So, and Veterans for Peace is an organization made up of military veterans, family members, allies, and the idea is to build a culture of peace. And the primary function, I would say, is to expose the true costs of war.
That comes up on the website often, and your mission statement, it is so clear: to increase the public awareness of the cost of war, to restrain government from intervening overtly and covertly in the internal affairs of other nations,
Yes.
to end the arms race, to seek justice, and to abolish war as national policy. It's like, what ideals they are. They're like so elevated. And do you find them overwhelming, or do you find them actually, by committing to them, I am not overwhelmed at those massive goals. I mean, the goals are humongous.
Yeah, I mean, my initial take looking at some of this as well, this is very ambitious, sounds great, but come on, really, how are we going to, stop nuclear weapons? How are we going to end war as an instrument of national policy? Yeah, but like you said, it does become possible. Attending my first, they have annual gatherings, well, you really start to find out what is possible, what people are doing at a local level to organize. And this stuff is not new, so learning some of the history of these things, the original Armistice Day, which we'll talk about in a little while, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which effectively abolished war as a means to solve disputes between countries. This was the legal basis for the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi and Japanese leaders were tried after World War II. Outlawing aggressive wars, preventive war, that kind of thing. So there is an international precedent for these things. These are, in a sense, this is a bringing back of old ideas and saying we can do better, we can restore some sanity to our foreign policy. A lot of the membership of Veterans for Peace are committed pacifists, but not everybody. Some folks are just those who don't necessarily want to do away with the military, but want to see it used in a more appropriate and measured manner.
When you have that national convention that you went to, that you said was very helpful when you went to the first one, from meeting colleagues from across the country, introduce us to what that process might be. What do they share at those national gatherings? And how did even one intervention there, one workshop, one speaker, one keynote, what did he or she do that set you to be coming back saying, well, I've got some marching orders, I've got some ideas here?
Yeah, well, I had just sort of gotten the ball rolling. It started really with about 3 of us who got together, 3 local veterans who wanted to organize this chapter. I went off to the my first national convention, which was in 2017 in Chicago, and yeah, it's 4 or 5 days of workshops, plenaries around all sorts of topics. So you're meeting people from all around the world. The UK chapter is especially vibrant. People coming from Okinawa who were resisting the presence of American bases. We had a delegation from Standing Rock come. I mean, really interesting stuff.
I bet.
This was in Chicago, where they have over 9,000 students enrolled in junior ROTC programs, mostly in black and brown communities. So you have poor kids either going into the prison system or going off into the military, and it's easy pickings for recruiters. And so this was an issue that was brought up.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things, and also this is what surprised me. There was a lot of entertainment as well, a lot of music and poetry and things like that, which at first I thought that's a little strange for veterans, but it actually was quite, I don't know, it was really inspiring. And I'm not one who's usually easily inspired by such things, but it was neat. I got a chance to try to do a little write-up for the Community Alliance.
Yeah, tell us about the Community Alliance, which has been one of your, I don't know, you have settled into this peace activist community. You received that award, the Way of Peace Award from Fresno Center for Nonviolence. So tell us a little bit about Community Alliance, which we did talk about with Mike Rhodes a few weeks ago, and also about the Fresno Center for Nonviolence Richards baby, and how that community has really supported you and that you've become an integral part of.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, Getting plugged in, we wouldn't be where we wouldn't have a chapter, frankly, or we wouldn't be able to do very much at all if it weren't for an existing base of support here in Fresno. The progressive community has been tremendous. So Richard Stone was really my kind of introduction. I was eventually invited to be on the board of the Fresno Center for Nonviolence, which I'm very proud to be a part of. I love the work that we do there.
Yeah.
The Center for Nonviolence is kind of an incubator for all sorts of other groups. It's a place to meet, it's a place to sort of get together, and then we have a lot of cross-pollination with memberships. So I'm on the board there. I also, I'm a member of Peace Fresno. Peace Fresno and Veterans for Peace does a lot together. WILP, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, they're amazing.
They are.
And all these groups. And the Community Alliance is a great forum for, getting the word out about things that we're doing, kind of raising these issues, putting Veterans for Peace on the local map, so to speak. So they've been really good about publishing a few pieces here and there, and that's been wonderful. So, for example, I think my first piece in the Alliance was coming back from Chicago and kind of a report back, and one of the things that I got to experience, there was meeting with all these veterans from World War II down to the more recent wars, and usually when you have a gathering of people with that much age diversity, geographical diversity, it doesn't seem like it would go together, but this was, everyone gelled together so magnificently around a common purpose. So there was a, there was a 92-year-old World War II veteran who was the oldest one in attendance, who was there doing slam poetry.
Oh my God.
Great guy, Jay Wink from New York, who passed away since. We're sorry to have lost him. And then a young 22-year-old female veteran who had literally just left the Army and was an aspiring hip-hop artist, and they're sort of doing the same thing, but everyone is kind of on the same page. One of the biggest moments was, the closing dinner. We sort of have a big banquet dinner, and one of the veterans at the table said something like, this feeling, what we're doing right here, this is what I joined the military for.
Wow.
To this camaraderie, and now I finally feel like we're doing it, and now we're doing it for the right reasons, right? Working for peace.
About the Community Alliance, there was that other article that we want to talk about because it's about the next big event, Armistice Day.
Yes.
A very important day that you are celebrating. And tell us a little bit about the event, Reclaiming Armistice Day, and also the whole idea of getting the community to understand the real original purpose after World War I of Armistice Day. But before you say that, I have to tell you a story that is God's truth. I must tell you. My dad was born on November 11th, 1914. And when he was 4 years old, he lived in New York. He was New York born. And the Armistice Day parade on November 11th, 1918, passes right by his house, his apartment, like 6th floor, New York. And he told me this, so it must have been true. He would have been obviously 104 years old this year. Armistice Day, 100 years old. He said, his mom said, Charlie, come here. Look out the window. Happy birthday. She used the pretext of this massive, glorious end of an awful war as saying, look at all this parade. So that's how it began, with an aspiration of celebrating peace, finally peace.
Right.
Tell us how it has devolved and what Veterans for Peace is trying to do.
Right. So that's a great story. So as you mentioned, First World War was known as the war to end all wars, as the way it was sort of built at the time, and horrific. I mean, something like 20 million perished. Really awful stuff. And at the close of that war, the idea was, the peace treaty goes into effect on the November 11th, the 11th day of the 11th month, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Yeah, and you know, all was quiet on the Western Front, and the idea was never again, you know, never again. And this was a day to commemorate the fallen, remember the sacrifice, and work towards peace. And the idea is, you know, not to do this again. And so for a long time in the United States, November 11th was sort of a sacred day, a day of somber reflection. Churches would typically ring the bells 11 times. There'd be a moment of silence at 11 o'clock. And so for a long time, that's what November 11th stood for. After the Second World War, obviously, it never again was not heeded, and there was another terribly destructive World War, even more so than the first. And after that, I guess it was somewhat understandable to expand the scope of this holiday. Yep. And in 1954, President Eisenhower signed Veterans Day, that, you know, Veterans Day would now, renaming the holiday from Armistice Day to Veterans Day to sort of celebrate all veterans returning from this war, mostly from World War II and then Korea. Well, over time, you know, Veterans Day has sort of drifted away from that original intended meaning of peace and more toward gratitude for veterans, which is a commendable value, but glorification. And, you know, we now have parades with, you know, military equipment, and it's a chance for flag waving, for sort of jingoistic patriotic slogans. And it's really kind of done a 180 from its original purpose, and it's frankly turned into a display of militarism and glorification, and this kind of culture of hero worship that we have for the military, which, you know, again, is in some sense understandable, but I think really takes us into some inappropriate territory when we're not really questioning what that service is for and what that service actually accomplishes in a lot of cases.
So Veterans for Peace wants to reclaim Armistice Day on this centenary event. What might you be doing nationally and locally to help our country come to relook or reimagine whatever November 11th could be for us?
Right. So what we're hoping to do is reclaim the spirit of Armistice Day. And the first thing really is to just educate people on what Armistice Day was, what Armistice Day is, what it still is, and to some degree in a lot of other countries still somewhat keep Armistice Day or Remembrance Day as it's known abroad, sort of in its original spirit. Yeah, and so this was also going to be the first year of the Trump military parade in Washington, D.C.
Ooh,
that
yeah.
was, you know, obviously being planned quite a while back. So that coinciding with the 100-year anniversary of Armistice Day seemed like a great opportunity to have our voices be heard. That the idea of that Veterans Day military parade on the streets of Washington was a very unpopular idea, even among sort of you know, veterans. I mean, even veterans who don't consider themselves Veterans for Peace. This was just not a popular idea, and so that has been delayed, at least, or so we're told for now. But yeah, we think it's important to hold an event for Armistice Day. So Washington, D.C., there will be a big event there, actually a series of events over that weekend, and then chapters around the country are trying to do what they can. So in some places it's a vigil, in some places it's you know, whatever we can do. So here in Fresno, it's still a little bit in the planning stages, but we do, one thing we're hoping to do is talk to local churches about Veterans, November 11th, Veterans Day, Armistice Day falls on a Sunday, so it's a perfect day to ring the bell, have a moment of silence, and encourage clergy to talk about Armistice Day and just devote a few minutes to their flock, you know, to kind of raise that awareness. And then the next day, the following day, Monday, November 12th, is the observed holiday. That's the day of the Veterans Day Parade. And Fresno's Veterans Day Parade is one of the largest in the country. It's actually quite significant. So we'd like to offer kind of an alternative to that, and that evening we'll be having an event. It looks like it's going to be at the community UCC.
Good.
In the sanctuary there.
Nice.
Keynote speaker, I hope I'm not jumping the gun here.
Mitch
Mitch
Jeserich.
Jeserich, yes.
Oh, Mitch Jeserich is
Journalist.
so awesome.
Yeah, he is.
So great that he's coming back to the Valley.
Right.
So what will Mitch do?
Well, Mitch Jeserich, obviously journalist and KPFA personality from the Bay Area. He'll talk about Armistice Day, talk about why, well, the things we just mentioned, why Armistice Day is something to be celebrated and why it's more relevant now more than ever. You know, we're right back in some sense where we started. We're in this, the midst of this insanity, this war or series of wars that there doesn't seem to be any end to. We're sort of locked on this
path. Pope Francis is right in your possibilities here. He has called this continuing small wars as the continuing world war, that it's just in pieces all over the globe. So it's good to know that you are getting some support from the Holy Father, but I will say that when we get what would be the announcement you'd like shared with local pastors, we will get that out to the local community of the Catholic parishes across the diocese to let them know that peace and justice are all the time high priorities in our church. But on a centenary of an event, Armistice Day, end of World War I, wouldn't we want to especially commemorate it with a prayer of the faithful? It could be easily inserted into the liturgy. This is not asking too much. We've only got, believe it or not, 2 or 3 minutes, but they're all yours. What are some more things you know you wanted to share with us, Josh?
Oh boy, well, let's see here. Well, I would just encourage people to check out Veterans for Peace, veteransforpeace.org. If you're local in the Fresno area, we have a local chapter website, vfp180.org. That's our local chapter designation, is Chapter 180, which I also think is pretty neat in that a 180 in military terminology is an about face, a 180, a turnaround. So
it is.
I kind of like that we caught that designation because it's kind of symbolic of what we're about. Absolutely. Right? We're trying to use our voice, our platform to work for peace. Yeah, and hopefully the Reclaiming Armistice Day event will get a lot of support. We hope to see a lot of folks come out from the community. I'd really like to see a little bit more outreach to veterans and to people who, you know, there's a lot of well-intentioned people who support veterans, support the troops, and, you know, they're not necessarily a fan of endless wars. Wars harm veterans, and so if you support helping war veterans, the first thing we might want to do is stop creating more war veterans. And that's kind of a simple thing, but it's a thing I think more people need to be exposed to.
We want to thank Josh Shurley for exposing us today to the group that he is president of locally, Chapter 180 of Veterans for Peace. We are supporting all veterans, and we are calling this country to a new awareness of peace. Thank you. God bless.